To a lot of gamers out there, the Soulsborne games is a series that's widely known for its punishing difficulty that can demand a lot from players sometimes. It's one of the more well-known franchises for that reason. Now, I'm not saying it's the hallmark of difficulty in gaming or anything, but before you played your first game in the series, you probably knew of one of these games because of how tough and challenging that they were. And one of the toughest aspects of these games are absolutely the bosses. In this video, I'll be going through each game from Demon Souls all the way to Elden Ring and highlighting which fight I believe to be the roughest, toughest and downright meanest in town. So let's get this started. Starting the discussion off with Demon Souls. Back in the roots of the series, bosses weren't the extremely skill focused encounters that they are nowadays. Because of this, I wouldn't say the bosses in Demon Souls placed too much significance on their difficulty. It was more so the puzzle aspect that the game focused on, with some exceptions of course because it is a Souls game. Firstly, I'll give an honourable mention to the Man-Eaters, as they were the gank to start the damn trend off. It's always a tricky fight as their AI are beyond bugged. They just love to take a break from the fight whenever they please and are generally just so stiff that it makes the battle a lot more unpredictable than their movesets make it out to be. There's also the arena where the fight takes place at, an extremely narrow bridge that's just asking for trouble. Balancing the two Man-Eaters in this fight can be tough, but a boss that I have more trouble with would have to be the Flame Lurker, who's my pick for Demon Souls. In my playthroughs, I usually go through all the Dash 1 levels in order of their worlds before advancing on to the Dash 2 levels, and I add in the Tower Knight after the Phalanx. So Phalanx, Tower Knight, Armor Spider, Fool's Idol, Adjudicator, Leechmonger. After these bosses, I then go on to face Flame Lurker. I'm only highlighting this because Flame Lurker is an insane step up from these bosses that I fight beforehand. It's the first fight where I'm like, what the fuck is going on? And I'm constantly checking how much grass I have left. His aggression is brutal and off-putting when you first encounter him. You rarely get time to breathe as he's always chasing you around the lava-filled arena. It's not his speed that makes him so oppressive, but the moveset overall is just very erratic and unpredictable. When you come from playing bosses with hour-long wind-ups like the Adjudicator to the quick and rapid punches that the Flame Lurker has, it's tough to adjust to. Another honourable mention I'd like to shout out would be the False King. He can be really hard, but one massive advantage for the player is that it's pretty much at the end of the game, so healing shouldn't be an issue with how grass functions. The game had its challenging bosses, but with the games going forward, difficulty will become much more of a forefront factor in some fights. As we move on to Dark Souls, the base game definitely had its tough encounters like the devilish duo of Ornstein and Smough, a boss fight that is well known for being a hardcore gatekeeper in terms of letting people progress onwards with their playthroughs. Not only is it a dynamic and punishing encounter against two enemies, but it was actually the first that had a full-on second phase in this point of the series, which definitely placed a lot more importance on endurance for players trying to make it through the fight. However, when the Artorias of the Abyss DLC was released, they cranked the difficulty of bosses up by a shit ton. Bosses like Calamity and Artorias were already harder than almost every base game boss. Even the introductory boss, the Sanctuary Guardian, swept a lot of players off their toes. However, Manus, Father of the Abyss, is my choice for the toughest boss of Dark Souls 1. I think he's just on another level, and while some people might throw Artorias into the conversation, on a new game cycle, I find him pretty manageable. On New Game Plus or further though, he can get pretty brutal. Back to Manus though, it's just a boss I truly feel outclassed against every time I run into. Like, it's never easy no matter how much experience I have, there's always some struggle. Firstly, he is just devastatingly quick. Doesn't look like he'd be, but he is, and whenever he tags me once, I get into that cycle of popping an Estus flask, then getting tagged again. It's super frustrating. When I actually am fighting him, the speed feels overwhelming and just a bit too fast for Dark Souls 1, with his constant aggression that restricts the living daylights out of you. His moveset is really punishing, no amount of distance keeps you safe, and he has wide swings that can catch you out wherever you are, as well as tail slaps so you don't stick to his behind. All attacks that can beat you to a pulp, whilst also being able to be stringed together with slight delays and subtle differences that always have you second guessing yourself. Of course, his 5-hit combo has to be the most deadly of the bunch, though it can work in your favour too, being a guaranteed moment to heal if you manage to identify the tell properly. Halfway throughout the fight, he gains the ability to use Dark Magic, which throws an extremely chaotic loop into the battle. The new attacks to learn need to be evaded perfectly, as they're pretty much game ending if a mistake is made. You can use the pendant, but even then, switching between items sometimes makes things a lot more panicky and can force out the stupidest of errors. All of this to say, Manus is rightfully placed as the final boss of the DLC, a true war of attrition that you'll have to go through to come out on top that feels oh so satisfying when you complete. Also, shout out to that Sanctuary Guardian duo. Let's just say, if you know, you know. Jumping to Dark Souls 2, I'm really torn for who to pick because honestly, I don't feel like there's any clear-cut hardest boss here. My struggles are balanced between a ton of bosses, but the reasons vary from one to another. Fume Knight and the Blue Smelter Demon are tough for how demanding they are of the player, requiring a lot of adaptability, not the start, with one being able to dual wield and use magic whilst the other is a reskin of a mid-game boss with different speed and switch-ups when it comes to attack patterns. On the other hand, there's the Gang Squad and the Ancient Dragon who frustrate me to no end, being extremely tedious battles that feel more unfair than challenging. In the Gang Squad, you're pitted against 3 NPC enemies like the name suggests, where you're forced to play cowardly so as to not get ganged up on yourself. And with the Ancient Dragon, he's just a really arduous encounter, stacked with a fuck ton of health, attacks that can devastate the largest of health bars, whilst also being able to force you into the most uncomfortable of positions. Both feel like watching paint dry. No boss in the game gave me as much trouble as Manus did from Dark Souls 1, as well as a couple others from the future games that I'll mention in a bit. However, amidst all that, I'm going to go with Sir Alon for the toughest boss in the game. On my first playthrough, he's definitely one that gave me the most struggle. As his design suggests, he's a skilled swordsman with very particular attack patterns that can really punish you if you mistime a dodge. His combos vary and ensure that you'll be razor focused on when you can attack or not. However, his speed has him covered in that aspect too, because a lot of times, even when you do have a window to attack, he'll jump back to safety in the blink of an eye. Don't forget the thrust attack that can buff his weapon too. It requires some really precise timing and can look extremely ridiculous if timed incorrectly. Also, the run back is atrocious, and I swear to God it adds extra pressure for you in this fight. The first thing that comes to mind when I die is, fuck's sake, I have to run through this shite again. As opposed to someone like the Fume Knight, where I'll die and think about the next attempt straight away, as his bonfire is about 5 seconds away from the fog gate. Little side tangent there, but it really does add some weight to the encounter, I feel. A great thing about Sir Alon though is the animation for completing the battle hitless, a magnificent incentive to perfect his fight. Such a great reward as he earns his spot for the toughest boss in Dark Souls 2 for me. Next up we have Bloodborne, which departed from the slower combat that the first 3 games had to offer in favour of a quicker and more visceral style of gameplay. It made fighting against these bosses more dynamic, but also made room for some of the most difficult ones that the series had in store for us up until that point. Now, I'm not going to be factoring in challenge dungeons when I'm choosing the spot for this video, but I will give a shout out to all 3 of the bosses in the Defile dungeon. Having half health is just an easy spell for disaster, especially against some of the biggest, most fiery and cheesy fucking enemies that these dungeons have to offer. But excluding those wankers, with Bloodborne, the trend of having the DLC bosses be harder than the base game bosses is the most apparent here because they ramp up the difficulty a lot, even from the first boss, Ludwig the Accursed. He's a nightmare, but the Orphan of Cause is the headliner for this game when it comes to difficulty. He has a moveset that is extremely awkward to play around, attacking at a moment's notice. A highly aggressive boss with even higher damage output. I swear every attack feels like a bulldozer connecting with a wall. His first phase is hard but pretty manageable after a few attempts, but once you reach his second phase, shit kicks off as he grows wings and flies around throwing his nasty fucking shrimp about. Being able to summon lightning is one of the biggest jumps in difficulty that the series has, to be honest. However, I think one huge aspect about the fight that doesn't make it the hardest in the game for me would have to be the fact that his attacks are interruptible. Being able to backstab or parry his attacks is absolutely massive in terms of difficulty in my opinion. Even if it's hard to pull off, you can essentially just spam your gun until one lands, and that's a load of health taken away that easily. One boss that doesn't quite have this luxury would be Lawrence, the first vicar, who is my choice for the video. He's a boss that stresses the hell out of me, and even with Bloodborne being my most played game in the series, I still feel absolutely ass at this fight, I'll be honest. Essentially being an endgame version of the Cleric Beast on crack, his moveset combined with the confined space of the arena make it such a difficult fight to navigate yourself in. I always feel like my back is against the wall. It's suffocating and plays a part in my mind whilst trying to dodge whatever fiery attack he's about to dish out. Speaking of which, his moveset is rough to manage. Any attack can pretty much delete a fraction of your health bar, and if you get hit by a combo, it's lights out. What makes his attacks extra tricky is the range and also the lingering hitboxes that the fire provides. It punishes any mistimed dodges and adds a little bit of pressure. This is before he ditches the bottom half of his body and only becomes the top half, where the fire gets especially intense, with the music going incredibly hard with all the new attacks you have to adjust to. This phase is really about playing it cautiously, because he leaks some lava wherever he goes that can nastily stun lock you into place. Honestly though, I find this phase a lot more doable than the other one, as he doesn't take up too much of the arena, but the main thing I find is that I need to stay calm because positioning is key. But you really do need to be perfect here, because if you dodge wrong once, you are Finished. It's always a slog of a fight whenever I get to him. Good God. Now that we're on to Dark Souls 3, we've officially transferred over to the fast-paced era. Most bosses are expecting quite a bit from the player and you have got to be agile and ready for anything and everything. Even though I feel pretty comfortable against the roster now, I still get my ass whooped every now and then. Although on my first playthrough, Pontiff Sullivan really bent me over. I struggled enough with the fast combos and the nature of how he dual wielded, but when I saw him summon a clone in his second phase, for the first time I felt so out of my depth. It was the ultimate despair at the time. But at that point he did force me to get a lot better at the game. Another contender would be Nameless King. The disorientation going against his first phase, the endurance of the second phase, plus all the delays, he was the prototype for Elden Ring bosses, and I guess we'll be seeing him again in Elden Ring Night Rain somehow. However, the two bosses who I easily have the most difficult time with, even to this day, would have to be Dark Eater Medea and Sister Fried. Medea has a huge health pool that feels like dumping a fish into an ocean. It's fucking giganormous. Is that even a word? It's not. Well, there you go. He can be a grueling battle, especially if you're just used to sticking to the legs for dragon fights. Figuring out that the head was the main source of damage to go for felt revolutionary, but posed another challenge, which was his moveset. Composed of various types of claw swipes, tail swings, bites and combos of the bunch. Even the devastating laser beams and magic attacks in phase 2. It's all a lot to deal with, but I've gotten to a point where I can manage it pretty handily. So I'm giving this spot to Sister Fried, just because of how insane of an endurance test it is. 3 phases with 3 different health bars. The combination of the first 2 alone would be enough to land it pretty high on a list of Dark Souls 3 bosses, difficulty wise, but my goodness, that last phase on a first playthrough felt so demoralizing. Don't get me wrong though, I really love this fight, but oh my god, it had me so frustrated when I first played it. The first phase is a comfortable duel in an enclosed arena. It shouldn't give players much trouble other than the invisibility gimmick, which is honestly really cool once you figure it out. But once you do get to the second phase and Father Ariandel joins the fray, the arena gets enlarged and things get very hectic. They share a single health bar though, which is great and does change the way players can approach this phase. I usually just bum rush the Father, as Fried stays pretty passive if you do so, although she will try to heal them once or twice, which is something you'll need to watch out for. However, once you get past them, it's time for Black Flame Fried. Oh my days, it's like getting slapped in the morning. The sheer shock it instills in you, no one forgets their first time seeing this phase. She has some of the quickest and longest combos in the game. They put the fear of God into you and have you panic rolling like a madman. It makes it a very long fight, and just due to its nature, I'm always rushing phases 1 and 2 to try and get back to 3. It's a fight that forces editors out of the player, and each time I get to it in my playthrough, I make sure I have at least an hour before I'm getting off so I can truly lock in. It is a crazy fight, but I do love it and always look forward to it. Moving on to Sekiro, a game where I think the consensus for the hardest boss would be Sword Saint Ishin. That may be true on an initial playthrough, but with how well you improve in Sekiro over multiple playthroughs, I'm pretty confident in my playstyle over the final boss. 2 bosses who I struggle more with would have to be Owl Father and the Demon of Hatred, the latter of which being a 3-phase battle that's a different style of fight than the usual rhythm that Sekiro goes for. It's not the familiar back and forth that you're used to up until that point. Instead, the Demon of Hatred has a moveset that forces out a lot more dodges than deflections, which can be quite the jarring switch up to get used to. It's one of the rare fights in the game where I end up finishing the boss through its own health bar instead of the posture bar. However, I'm leaning more towards the Hirata Estate version of Owl's fight. The fight atop Ashina Castle was already a battle that I struggled with, as it takes a while to drop his posture bar and I'd shockingly just fall for a lot of the tricks he had. The worst being the anti-heal throwable that is insanely telegraphed, yet my dumbass always got hit by it. This only got tougher when fighting the Father variant, who repeatedly beats my ass to this day. He relies less on the deceptive tricks and more on brute force, which sounds great, but my word, is it still insane. Getting through his 2 phases feels like eating through all of this shit. The toughest part is all the switch ups that he has from his previous fight. Having to adjust and adapt to different endings of certain attacks creates a lot of instances where I fall for easy bait. Now I'm sure some of you Sekiro enjoyers are thinking, well, what about the inner fights? Well, it's also Owl. He's just him in terms of difficulty. I think Genichiro has the biggest jump in challenge from his base game to his inner form, but the inner Owl fight is really damn tough with just how quick he is and how he can transition from his body form to his spectral form. It might be mechanically the best fight in Sekiro. It's so much fun. All the inner fights are great and tough as balls. Imagine the scenes though if they made an inner Demon of Hatred. I think I'd have fucking killed myself playing that. After all these bosses, now we've brought ourselves to Elden Ring. Now for the interest of making all my experiences over these games I'm talking about equal, I'm talking about the bosses without factoring in any spirit summons or NPC summons into the equation. Now when it comes to the main bosses, this game can be damn tough, I'm not gonna lie. From the entire finale of the Radagon and Elder Beast fight to the acrobatic menace that is Malekith, this game can dick you down in a shit ton of encounters. Now I've got reasoning for two different fights for this video. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the final boss of the DLC, Promised Consort Radahn, a boss that came out like half a year ago at this point, so I'm gonna need some help from you guys here in deciding this spot, because I'll be honest, I've not done a playthrough of the DLC after he got nerfed. I saw all sorts of response to this online, from people saying that his fight is a shell of its original to barely anything has changed, but I'll give you my thoughts on the fight pre-nerf. It was the toughest fight in the series. Radahn battered the living shit out of me. Bro, I was humbled beyond belief for the end of the DLC. Like, I had a tough time in the DLC overall, but I was surprised that there wasn't this insane jump of difficulty like the other From Software DLC had. And then Promised Consort Radahn happened. That second phase was absolutely nuts. It was like phase 1 I could go hitless, and then phase 2 Radahn will go hitless instead. However, now that there's been a nerf, I'm not sure if this pick is still valid, so you guys gotta let me know. And because of that, I'll be giving this spot to Melania, because time after time I take a significantly more amount of attempts to beat her than the other bosses in the game. She has a ton of tools in her kit that make her a fat challenge. 2 phases with full health bars, well, not the second one, but close enough. It's not the usual transformation halfway through the initial health bar, which is challenging alone. There's also the lifesteal mechanic, which can be really demoralizing during an attempt to just see her health slowly go higher and higher, especially for shield mains. I just tend not to look at her health bar much, only a slight glance every now and then. And then there's her moveset, which consists of some of the trickiest attacks in the series to work around. Her regular attacks hit incredibly hard on their own, but attacks like the clone spirits and especially the infamous waterfall dance make the fight a nightmare. It makes me realize how important spacing and positioning is in this game. Overall though, I'd say it's the hardest fight for me, because even with the hundreds of hours I've put into the game, it still somehow takes me a few filthy hours to beat. And there we go, the hardest boss from each game according to me, the most important opinion that you should listen to, of course. In all seriousness though, if you've made it to the end of the video, then thank you so much for watching. We've had enough of my opinions for the video, so let me know, what do you think? Do you agree with my picks? Who do you struggle with the most in each game? This will be an interesting one to read the comments on. Be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this, whether it be countdowns, lists like these, or even essay style videos about the Soulsborne games. Also, thank you guys for 200 subscribers. I'm so excited to see the channel growing. Have a great day everybody, I'll see you in the next one, and peace!